Well, for more on this, we're joined by legal analyst Dr. Shadi Maganoe. Dr. Maganoe, good evening. Thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate it. IDAC is a relatively new organization in our democratic and accountability infrastructure, so to speak, right? It was born out of the recommendations of Justice Zondo, Deputy Chief Justice Zondo, when he was the chairperson of the State Capture Commission of Inquiry. And IDAC was meant to do a very specific thing within the crime fighting and justice cluster, so to speak. And now it finds itself in all of what is tumultuous controversies that has brought the organization into disrepute. Has the response by the minister as well as by the NPA head struck the right tones, and have they used the full scope of their constitutional and statutory powers to intervene here?
Good evening, and thank you for having me. I think when we are listening, or when we listened to the announcements, I think this is probably the most important institutional reset since the establishment of IDAC, right? So the leadership has acknowledged governance weaknesses and has basically committed to reviewing internal controls and accountability mechanisms and I think that is important, or it's an important first step in that sense, because they acknowledge that there are governance issues and they want to deal with them. So I think the challenge that they are going to have now is implementation, because if you remember, one of the things that they said was legislative reform. I don't think we need legislative reform. South Africa has great laws, and it also takes a long time to either amend or create new laws. So Parliament is not going to wake up tomorrow and create a new law. It's going to take time. So the question then would be, what are we doing in the meantime? And that would basically mean we must implement the current laws that we have now, which is why I don't necessarily think that we need legislative reform in that sense. We need to better implement the current laws that we have. And I think also, just to take from today's announcements, is that what was also it was encouraging, because they acknowledged that governance must improve, but accountability is not achieved by introducing more rules, which is basically what I said when it comes to legislative reform. I think it's achieved when those entrusted with public power apply the existing law independently, without fear, favor, or prejudice, which is one of the constitutional provisions that we have when it comes to accountability. The real test will not be the reforms announced today. It will be whether those reforms change institutional culture and they also restore public confidence within IDAC.
Yeah. What gap does IDAC really fill in our accountability infrastructure democratically that other arms of the justice and crime prevention cluster are not able to? That is to say, is the function of IDAC so uniquely important that we can't do without it?
I think IDAC was created to fill a specific gap, which would then mean from the Zondo Commission, what was basically identified is that we did have a gap. And that is why we ended up with IDAC. So I don't think we should dismantle or disband IDAC. IDAC is an important institution. And the reason why I'm saying that is because if it wasn't, then the Zondo Commission wouldn't have recommended it. IDAC was created or established to deal with high-level corruption. It was created to deal with a specific aspect of corruption, and that is why you find it generates, or it takes its powers from the NPA Act. And I think it's enough to take those powers or authority from the NPA Act. What we find challenging now, or what has been revealed from the Madlanga Commission, is that those powers may have been abused. So the reason why I say may have been is because the Madlanga Commission is also still trying to establish whether there was an abuse of power or not. It's still speculative, which is why we must also not say that IDAC has abused its powers, because the Madlanga Commission has not made that finding. But I think whether IDAC is important or not, or whether it's filling a gap, it was supposed to fill the gap when it comes to high-level corruption. And I think what was revealed in the Madlanga Commission is that it didn't necessarily investigate the matters that it was supposed to investigate from state capture with the same amount of vigor that it did when it came to the matters that it actually investigated. And
just a last question. One of the reforms that's being introduced by the minister and the head of the NPA is that there would be a review of all the cases that had been investigated by IDAC. If you are someone who has been on the receiving end of the wrath, so to speak, of IDAC, whether or not you've been prosecuted successfully and or perhaps charged by IDAC. Are there recourse for such people? We know that the charges against, General Dumisani Khumalo had now been withdrawn, but there are many more who currently still have charges brought against them by IDAC. What does this mean for the status of those charges?
I think what it basically means is that if any individual believes that an investigation was conducted unlawfully against them, either unlawfully, irrationally, or in bad faith, our laws provide mechanisms to challenge the exercise of public power. That is why we have administrative law. So depending on the circumstances that they may seek reform, they could go through judicial review. That would basically be administrative law, and then we will check whether the exercise of power was exercised rationally and legally. They can also pursue civil claims if they suffered legally recognizable harm, and then, or they could rely on the findings of the Madlanga Commission if those findings become relevant in subsequent proceedings. But I think it's important to note that this will depend on the merits of each case. It won't be a blanket application.
Yeah, Dr. Shadi Maganoe, thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate it. Thank you so much for your insights on that.